You're doing one problem.
It's like the.
Really?
Okay, we're gonna get started. So welcome everyone to this event for Comedy Against Work, Utopian Longing in Dystopian Times, which needs no explanation. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder of the Bureau of General Services Square Division, along with my partner, Don Jokum. The Bureau, we like to say, is a government agency for a government that does not yet exist. And this is the service that we provide, is holding this space for queer culture. So we have regular bookstore hours 1 to 7, Wednesdays through Sundays, and then we often stay open later for events like this. Back to you. If you're not already on our email list and you would like to be, you can sign up to that at the back of the room, and you'll get an email every other Monday about our many upcoming events. Let's see, what else do we need? Oh, right. We do ask for a donation. We have a suggested donation of $10, but give what you can, if you can. And there's some change in here. You can also Venmo us at BGSQD, those letters that are all around you. Or if you would like to support us by buying books, that is a perfectly legitimate way to do so. So thank you. And with that, I'm going to do a quick land acknowledgement, and then I will introduce our two panelists. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We are actively seeking to partner with and provide material support to a local queer Indigenous organization. And we hope to make an announcement about this partnership in the near future. But in the meantime, we encourage you to join the Bureau when signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community House's Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more about that at mannahattafund.org. So Madeline Lane-McKinley is a writer, professor, and Marxist feminist with a PhD in literature from the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is a founding member of Blind Field, a journal of cultural inquiry. Her writing has appeared in publications such as Los Angeles Review of Books, Boston Review, The New Inquiry, Entropy, Guts, and Cultural Politics. She is also the author of the chapbook Dear Z and a contributor to the Museum of Capitalism. M.E. O'Brien writes on gender, freedom, and communist theory. She co-edits 2 magazines, Pinko on gay communism and Parapraxis on psychoanalytic theory and politics. Her work on family abolition has been translated into Chinese, German, Greek, French, Spanish, and Turkish. Previously, she coordinated the New York City Trans Oral History Project and worked in HIV and AIDS activism and services. She completed a PhD at New York University, where she wrote on how capitalism shaped New York City LGBTQ social movements. She is currently in training to be a psychoanalyst and works as a therapist, has headlined all across the country, including Los Angeles, Chicago, Denver, St. Louis, New Haven, and Baltimore, just to name a few. Please welcome them both.
It's really nice to be here. Thank you, Greg, for your hospitality. It's nice to see so many familiar faces, some of whom I haven't seen in a really long time. So thanks for coming up. I'm going to begin by reading a couple of excerpts from towards the end of the book, and then we'll do a little Q&A and then open it up to everyone. So if you have things in mind that you want to discuss, we will make time for that towards the end. So if you have a book and you'd like to read along, I'm going to be reading starting from chapter 9, which is a chapter called Care, Laughter, and the Constraints of Capitalist Life. This begins with some discussion that's picked up from the last chapters on the kind of the dynamics of care that came up around the pandemic also, which I'm happy to speak more to. While more and more comedy has come to resemble emotional crisis management in the face of ever worsening capitalist destruction, care is what stands for so many of the demands of capitalist work. Here, I want to consider the possibilities of care and comedy, how through comedy, we might deconstruct the work ethics implied by the self-care industry and also enact forms of collective care based in anti-work critique and struggle. But before turning to this possibility, we should ask what care even means in capitalist life. With the shift in the relative proportion of jobs to service work in the last few decades, especially, however we might characterize this dramatic change, more kinds of work have blurred with care work, just as more workers find themselves never-endingly in conflict with this, quote, vexed emotion known as care, as Jasmine Gibson calls it. Projected outside the logic of work often exceeding the idea of work with notions of love and responsibility, care describes the process by which capitalism takes what's beautiful and makes it dreadful and violent. Gibson asks what it means to, quote, care when your labor power is being exploited, when you are susceptible to sexual, emotional, and mental violence on the job, or in conflict about the emotions you experience for the children you care for, feeling both compassion and resentment all at once. While care is the defining feature of the most exploitative and devalued kinds of work, care is also key to how we might approach our everyday activities as reaching beyond, if not undermining and sabotaging the logic of work. To the call of post-work imagining, care exposes this entanglement of dystopian constraints and utopian desires. For years, I have vacillated between a few different feelings about care, and by now I'm certain that making up my mind isn't quite the point, though it may be for others. At times, I become captivated by a thought, feeling, or faint expression of something that may be in work stranglehold, but which still breathes a different air. In moments of caring for my kid, it's sometimes as if I'm not in this world, but another one entirely that's just ours. Watching my friend show up for another friend after her mother died, there's a certain quality to the light and sound. Time slows down and we find ourselves caring for each other in a way that nevertheless quickly evaporates. And then there are times at my job which have this flavor to them as well. These are moments of making a difference in someone's life unquantifiably, supporting someone as they read Marx or Angela Davis for the first time, watching someone discover that Batman is actually fascist, getting to be there when someone figures out something essential about their childhood, even when helping someone understand the difference between parenthetical clauses and M-dashes, this feeling is there lurking. There are times when I find myself chipping away at the world of work with the hope of finding something else buried beneath it, the revolutionary drive that has merely been robbed from us and hidden away. But then I remember that this is part of the trap of work, that this is how so much of work works. Even the, quote, supposedly virtuous activities of life-making carried out by professional women, state employees, such as teachers, nurses, and social workers, as Kirsten Moreau argues, perpetuate the antagonism and social misery inherent to capitalism. This virtuosity is, of course, part of why these kinds of work, along with household labor and other forms of reproductive labor, are so precarious, despite being so socially necessary. But it is often a visceral experience of these jobs which demand workers to work with their hearts. Beyond minor acts of sabotage, there's little we can do for ourselves on an individual basis as workers in this trap. I know teachers from K-12 to college who worked incredibly hard to develop approaches to grading that strive to be equitable, student-centered, and social justice-oriented. We spend countless hours discussing ways that we can modify our individual philosophies of grading. Without any hope of changing the system of grading we are all still beholden to, a system that reproduces inequalities, creates competition, and ultimately conveys to the student that everything they've experienced as a learner can be reduced to a letter as a future worker. And the more we care, it would seem, the more we are trapped in these contradictions. We can do our best to approach these contradictions ethically, and that's of course important, but it hardly makes up for political transformations that remain urgent across education systems. When I extend these questions of what happens to care under capitalism to my life and work as a parent, it often feels unbearable. What does it mean to be life-making in this world, as Monroe asks, when this entails, quote, cultivating and sustaining the desired human qualities and capacities that capitalism simply appropriates for profit? These questions are amplified by ongoing ecological crisis. With each wildfire that eviscerates the West Coast, where I live with my kid and smoke for months out of the year, I am often overwhelmed with sadness about the future and the world I brought this child into. To these unbearable moments haunting motherhood, Jacqueline Rose asks, what are mothers being asked to carry? What forms of failure and injustice are they made accountable for? What are the fears we lay on mothers? Why do we expect mothers to subdue the very fears we ourselves have laid at their door? Mothering, as I have learned, wrestles with these questions without end. There is no reconciliation. The only way to stop wrestling is to become subsumed. Unless we recognize what we are asking mothers to perform in the world and for the world, Rose writes, we will continue to tear both the world and mothers to pieces. Of course, part of this can be tearing oneself apart. To be a mother often means to blame oneself for the world or trying to make up for it. Care crystallizes the most dystopic, coercive aspects of capitalist life, distorting, it would seem inevitably, what we might be able to comprehend as love into a system of profit. And yet care also approximates our most utopian urges and catches insights into revolutionary practices with the sparks of anti-work critique. Care demands that we think about what it would take individually and collectively to live against work. How might we differentiate this from the life-making activities that are all the while reproducing capitalism? Where can we sever the possibilities of care from the realities of work? These questions rush to my mind as I make stew. Over the pandemic, I cultivated a habit of making a stew or a soup about once a week to spread across several meals for my partner and kid. It first occurred to me as an inexpensive way to make my work in the kitchen more efficient. Stew cuts down on nightly costs, nightly cooking tasks, and the incessant dishes, as you just heat the stew up again every night with only bowls and spoons to rinse. But there's also the pleasure of hours melting away as I stand, part daydreaming, tending to a pot of various ingredients, letting the heat and smells hit my face, almost taking me somewhere else, while keeping me there just the same. I have learned from the pleasure of watching as a pot of water becomes broth with the addition of a few bones and onion peels, and from the techniques and questions asked in minding its flavor. I add to the pot what's around in my pantry, which is always a little bit different and involves experimentation. Having studied Marxist feminism for much of my adult life, I'm certainly armored against romanticizing the kitchen, the setting of so much invisible labor, while I often wonder about the space and all that I do in it, what worlds it puts me into contact with, even faintly. With invisibility comes a different sense of what could be. I'd love to keep reading that section, but I'm going to move from stew into the end of the book. From stew to blob, which is my last kind of metaphor, and this is orange jello, which is my blob. That's my cover. And my conclusion is called Anti-Work Comedy as Utopian Method. And really through the course of the book, I am looking at comedy as a genre into a utopian method. And by that, I mean a kind of revolutionary practice of everyday life. So moving out of an idea that comedy is this kind of exclusive art form that only some people can do. Lauren Michaels, my nemesis, says that there's only, I think, 600 funny people in the world all at once. So this kind of like hyper exclusionary concept of the comedian or who's funny, to something that we all do in our lives, whether we see it as comedy or not. So I'm gonna look at the third section of this last chapter, but I'll briefly say that I focus in on three kinds of places where I can imagine anti-work comedy as a utopian method. And the first is play, and I'm kind of fucking around with how play is appropriated by workplaces, especially as like a really anti-utopian basically way of extracting labor and kind of tricking laborers into thinking that they're having fun when they're really just losing sight of what fun actually could ever be. The second is sleeping. Sleeping is perhaps the closest we can get to an anti-capitalist practice, as Jonathan Crary argues in his great book, 24/7, that capitalism and the ends of sleep. So I kind of briefly look at that. And then my last section is called blog. And instead of explaining that, I'm just gonna read it. So one of my dearest friends used to come over for dinner on Friday nights. He'd usually be the one to cook, and I'd usually be the one to do the dishes. Our dogs would play in the backyard, and my kid would sit on a kitchen stool beside him or take a bath in the adjacent bathroom. It was a nice routine. Our other routine was going to the beach all together on Tuesday mornings. One Friday, we laughed together over dinner, and after putting my kid to bed, we sat outside. It was a warm night in early spring with a big moon hanging over us. Perhaps I felt hopeful, but my friends seemed particularly grim as we began talking about the future. We were both trying to finish our dissertations, running out of time with university funding, struggling to imagine what might come next. He could see it clearly enough. An academic job market in which the prospects of tenure track security were running dry, of more and more adjunct positions with scarce benefits and short-term contracts, of endless applications and interviews if we were lucky. But that didn't seem so lucky after all. We commiserated, and I probably made a pathetic attempt at emotionally problem solving what was far beyond either of our reach. I remember putting my head on his shoulder and how I wondered if I should give him a longer hug before he left. That next Tuesday, we didn't go to the beach as he had killed himself on Monday night. I'm writing about Chris Chitty, the author of Sexual Hegemony, which my comrade Max very kindly posthumously edited for all of us. Chris's death was absolutely devastating to anyone, or to everyone who knew him. He was loved by many, hated by others, but such a vibrant utopian thinker. He spent much of his time inhabiting an intellectual project that became psychologically exhausting, often putting him into contact with revolutionary desires that were so strong that they overwhelmed him, as he lived in a studio, often going days without the company of anyone but his dog. It is painful work to continue insisting that a life against capitalism, or even a life after capitalism, might be ours. For some, it is too painful. How quickly the utopian bends towards dystopia. I've met few people as brilliant, and I can still hear his laugh, as any of his friends would. I can still see his Cheshire cat smile. In my family and among my friends, I had been this close and closer to suicide a few times before. Chris's death brought back all of those deaths and the complicated ways in which I had and hadn't fully grieved them. His death reminded me of my friend Alex, who killed himself a few months after we graduated from college. It was 2007, and he had just been released into the quote adult world under a pile of seemingly insurmountable student debt. In the years to come, deaths like this were happening everywhere, all the time. As the financial crisis would go on to obliterate so much that had been cast in the future, suicide rates spiked. While suicide rates were already still steadily rising, the crisis years saw a dramatic increase. Between 2008 and 2010, the suicide rate in the US grew 4 times faster than it did in the 8 years leading up to the crisis. What made Chris's suicide so much more challenging for me to grieve than Alex's or even that of my stepfather was the experience of parenting through it. For a long time, it felt hopeless for me to keep in character as a caretaker, as I was often fighting back tears and finding myself flooded with memories. What I wanted to do was crawl into bed and never get out. I wanted my time to be mine so that I could heal from all this pain. But every morning I woke up to a 3.5-year-old needing me to be there. I had to build up emotional armor to get through the days. It took months before the crying spells and flashes of sadness and self-blame and anger slowed down, and life started to feel a bit more bearable. I began running in the woods with my dog, and almost every night I would watch comedies. Here's the comedy part. If you're wondering. So one of my favorite comedies at that time, and for that matter of all time, was Maria Bamford's 2012 special, The Special, 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 which I watched with a few of my friends on a regular basis. So for those who don't know, The Special, Special, Special marked Maria Bamford's first hour of material after an 18-month period of 3 hospitalizations in different psychiatric wards in Los Angeles. The special was filmed in her house for an audience of 2, her parents, almost a decade before COVID-19 would make these kinds of experiments much more commonplace. Throughout the special, Bamford pauses to serve her parents and the crew burnt cookies fresh from the oven, administer her dog's eye medication, offer a pee break to her dad, answer the door for a pizza delivery, and go out to the breaker system when the lights go out. And she moves between recollections of her time in the psych ward, descriptions of her everyday experiences of anxiety, and her struggles of ongoing suicidation. If you stay alive for no reason at all, please do it for spite. Bamford jokes. People don't talk about mental illness the way they do about other illnesses, she explains, shifting into her Karen voice, a wealthy, judgmental white woman who dips in and out of most routines. Apparently, Steve has cancer. It's like, fuck off. We all have cancer, right? Cancer, pretty bad right now. And I go to chemotherapy. I get it taken care of. I get back to work. Then she pivots into the deep voice of a Southern man. Yeah, I was dating this chick. All this time, apparently, she let me know she's been wearing contact lenses. I said, wow, do what you need to do, but I don't believe in all that Western medicine shit. If you want to see like other people, it's all about attitude. You've got to. Much of Bamford's comedy targets these tropes of mental health stigmatization, and specifically perceptions of mental health struggles, as simply a matter of poor work ethic or lack of ambition. While reducing mental illness to something you have to work harder to overcome, this perception also erases the never-ending work, often unseen if not hidden, that so many of us in this world have grown accustomed to as a matter of everyday survival. Always speaking to her audience as fellow crazies and weirdos, Bamford offers practical and funny tips for how to get through the day, as in a quote, homeopathic remedy for depression if you're ever feeling terrible and you don't have insurance, which she describes with step-by-step instructions. Here's what you do. You take a blue or a black pen, you draw a rabbit's face atop your own face, make some rabbit ears out of paper plates, cotton balls, I don't know what you have. And then you make some fudge, which is very easy to make from what I've read. You go out on your front porch, you open up your window and you start yelling at it. She recommends saying, "Hi, how you doing? Want some fudge?" Because, quote, "it gets you out and about in your community. And it shows everyone that you need help." What's remarkable about moments like this is how Bamford engages with comedy itself as a part of her mental health treatment. More than that, she conceives of comedy as a way to get out of the ideology of work, which promises sanity, happiness, and fulfillment through more and more work. Hers is a comedy staunchly against work. It is a comedy of survival. The first time I saw Bamford perform, it was summer of 2016, a little over a year after Chris's death, and a few months after I filed my dissertation. I was still a mess with grief and entering a whole new kind of turmoil post-graduate school. When I found out that Bamford was going on tour, I got tickets for myself and 2 friends. We'd all been through a lot in that time, and we all loved Bamford. It was something I looked forward to for months. Much of the show was material we hadn't heard before, more about mental health struggles. At some point in the show, I remember she talked about how healing feels better than hopelessness, and that while the laughter continued, I reached over to my friend and realized that she was crying. We held hands. I began to cry too. And we also kept laughing. After the show, Bamford stayed for well over an hour in the theater lobby, speaking to fans one by one as they waited in line to meet her. Standing in that line with my friends, I was struck by the way her comedy had brought this group of people together. In this dingy community theater in Campbell, California, where I imagined decades of productions of A Christmas Carol and The Nutcracker had transpired. I don't know if any of you were there. You might have. Horrible. There were teenagers, elderly, people wearing anything from pajamas to expensive ensembles, people smelling like weed and BO, and people smelling like perfume. As we got closer to Bamford and the line, I began eavesdropping on her interactions with fans. When one woman opened her arms for a hug and told Bamford, "You saved my life," I wondered how many others in the line she was speaking for. I felt this energy again the next time I saw Bamford perform, long before she walked on stage. The crowd was similarly varied, but this time it was even more clearly a gathering of the weirdos who'd survived. Perhaps the feeling was so pronounced just because I expected it. By the end of the show, I had a name for this feeling: blob. This is the scariest part of the show, Bamford tells her audience, as she conducts this strange experiment as the closer of her 2017 special, Old Baby. This is more one-woman show territory. Apologies, apologies, she mutters. I'm trying to believe in something, something more bigger than myself, and I just can't. I can't think of anything. But then I remembered there was this game we used to play when we were kids, and it's called One Big Blob. I'm it. You run away from me, frightened, afraid. I begin running after you while chanting, "One big blob, one big blob, one big blob." Eventually the blob ends up catching one of you, and it's going to be you, she says, reaching out for the hand of someone in her audience, telling them quite sweetly, "I got you, come on." The person laughs as they hold hands, and she continues. And now we both have to begin chanting, "One big blob, one big blob." And now you catch the person next to you, "One big blob." And then we start chanting start catching each other. "One big blob, one big blob." As Bamford chants this into the microphone, members of the audience slowly come together, grasping hands and joining the chant. Bamford keeps telling them, "I'm going to wait, and I know it's weird, you can do it," as she hangs on until everyone has become part of the blob. At which point she tells them, "This is great. Isn't it uncomfortable to be in the blob? It's so awful. Your hands are sweaty, but you have to do it. And we have to stay together. And everyone must let themselves be caught, because otherwise the game will never end. And it is a shit game." Everyone laughs, still holding hands, looking at each other. "Anyways, we could just blob it on a few things. I could hang a religion on that," she explains, before letting go of the blob. After the show, I tried to describe what it was like to be in the blob to several people, always feeling myself short of words, never quite getting at the thing. The blob stayed with me though. It kept coming back, felt awkward and sweaty, but also warm, soft, and even caring. The blob returned to me with intensity in April 2021, when I most recently saw Bamford perform. This time, it was from my kitchen under lockdown, and I was unsure of what I was in for. The show was not just a show, it was what Bamford had been promoting as a slumber party. The night began with material from guest comedians, and then Bamford took the stage of a desk in her living room and performed about an hour of material. Like the other remote comedy performances I'd attended during the pandemic, this one felt stilted and at times uncomfortable. But Bamford has always put the awkward up front and somehow seemed more at ease than during the live shows I'd attended. After delivering her set, she stayed briefly to answer some questions from the audience and then promised everyone that she would be back to answer more questions at 6 a.m. She turned the camera into a pull-out sofa, arranged with dozens of stuffed animals, and she got under the blankets and spent some time reading. Then she went to sleep for about 7 hours. At this point, my partner went to bed and I stayed up. In the chat room, people were sharing their stories, telling each other about what their lives were like during COVID-19. Quite a lot of people lived alone, or for other reasons, experienced loneliness. When Bamford woke up the next morning, she opened up a Diet Coke, took her medications, and ate a spoonful of peanut butter. She spent a little time with those of us who were awake, whether we had stayed up all night with each other or, like me, set an alarm at 5:55 to catch her goodbye. We laughed a bit more, then she left, and so did everyone else. If we could just blob it, I keep thinking. I'll leave it at that.
So thank you, Madeline, for this really lovely book. It's accessible, it's really compelling. I learned a tremendous amount about comedy, which I did not know. And it's rich in thinking about this bridging the lives we live now for what we dream for. The sections you read gave a pretty good sense of elements of the personal context of you writing it. And I wanted to invite you to say a little bit more about the broader context in comedy. You mentioned post-2008 comedy boom and sort of the landscape of comedy that you're engaging.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think a lot of my project was formed out of two big moments that I had witnessed in comedy. The first was this comedy boom after the financial crisis, when we're seeing this return of like the arena comedian that we had in the 80s, but a huge expansion of them. And the stand-up comedian becomes a kind of entrepreneurial figure, I think, of the post-financial crisis kind of work ethic, whose work is very much coded as a kind of artistry that is therefore not to be waged until it is, and these type of things. The other thing that I was really responding to was noticing fascism emerging in comedy, right? And as a comedy geek from the early 90s, I had grown very used to people not taking comedy seriously. And and internalized that quite a bit, and I hadn't taken my own interest in comedy seriously. And you know, I not only questioned that, but became certain that that was a very dangerous thing about comedy, that it can appear as if it is unserious while being very much a vehicle for fascist thought, but also a weapon that we can use against that. So I think that those moments were really really important for me in piecing together this project.
It's in the current political moment. There's so much attacks going on around trans life, and an interesting element that you talk about here is how much of that sort of played out in comedy in a moment before it really played out in state legislators. Could you talk a little bit about the space of comedy as a site where people develop their politics and their political thinking and their political solidarities?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different facets of that. One I would just begin with is the one that doesn't realize it's doing that, right? Which is why I think fascism and anti-trans rhetoric and racist rhetoric and sexism kind of have free reign over this space of artistic freedom, things like that. But something that, you know, like my discussion of blob, which I understand is like really actually beautiful, wonderful joke, but a joke that inspires me to think utopically about comedy. You know, it is a form of solidarity building, or it can be a strategy of solidarity building, precisely because when we laugh, we form community with each other. We are laughing on the inside of something together, which is, you know, I think in queer spaces, in different segregated spaces, part of why comedy is a really important part of their histories.
Well said. So the book's organized, all this material that you read was from the last section. The book is organized of talking about comedy that is about work, and then comedy as work and sort of struggles within comedy, and then comedy as the utopian method. And you talk a lot about the history of labor struggles within comedy, and then more recently sort of thinking about the struggles around misogyny and transphobia and racism and whatnot within comedy. Where do you see the sort of edges of emerging struggles in comedy? Like, where do you think kind of new political directions are going?
Well, I think the really important kind of battle right now is over the supposedly anti-woke or versus woke comedians, which is, I think, a false binary that only anti-woke comedians insist upon the existence of. And it does a certain thing to say feminist or queer or Black or like any kind of minoritized comedian by forcing a kind of earnestness or sincerity, which is unfunny, which is responding to these kinds of attacks that we see, you know, Louis C.K., Dave Chappelle, Bill Burr. There's a long list that I won't go into, so I'll start turning red. My blood boils. So I think one interesting current is that there are interesting white men in comedy who are trolling the trolls. One I'm really interested in is Tim Heidecker. I know that you don't know comedy, but he's an interesting comedian who more or less pretends to be, he has an alter ego.
I read your blog post.
Okay. He more or less pretends to be an alt-right comedian, fascist comedian, and shows how unfunny those comedians are, which is actually how you get those guys, is to say it's not about your politics, it's about how you're just not funny and lame and you know, that your shtick doesn't work, right? That you're hack. So that's a really interesting current. And then there's a great like series of like trans comedians, feminist comedians who are just not engaging with it and forming small communities, pockets that are really powerful and in some ways immune to this ongoing harassment that they'll experience in like a more mainstream club circuit. But I think there's lots of ways that you're asking about like the future and what's going to be happening. I think those are the interesting sites of contestation, I see. You know, some of them.
How have comedians received your book so far, and how would you hope that the book might land in comedy circles?
I was telling Michelle, like, I really set myself up for failure because comedians notoriously or supposedly don't like feminists, they don't like critics, they don't like non-comedians saying that they know anything about comedy. So I was very honestly worried about what comedians would think about my book.
What did they think about revolutionary political theory?
What I've really been excited about is that I'm not really gunning for mainstream comedians to care about this. I'm mostly interested in like local comedy workers and people who love comedy on the left. And what I've noticed is a lot of people who have kind of said, I love comedy and I'm a leftist and I've thought these things were separate and I've kept these things separate. And in fact, I don't talk to my leftist friends about my comedy interests and vice versa, and how the book kind of invites not only that connection and dialogue, but like people to come out and say that they're interested in both of these things and comedy specifically as a political practice. I'm also just really interested in all of these local leftist comedians that are, working the stages and interested in connecting with them, and they're hearing about their relationship to comedy and reluctance to really think of it as work. So yeah, I've been mostly very happy, and of course there are trolls on the internet, but whatever.
So I'll just ask one more question so that we have a few minutes to open it up for the audience. So at times, utopian and anti-work seem like synonyms for radical in the book, but at times it seems like they're doing something much more than that. And could you say a little bit about the meaning of these as political rubrics and what they help us think about?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to, I guess, think about this specifically as a critical utopian project. So rather than thinking of utopia as like a representation or a program of a perfect world, to think of it as a methodology or a framework or a practice with which to engage in struggle. So that's really how I'm seeing these things connect. I'm not quite sure, like radicality, and I think that I'm gonna actually ignore that terminology. But yeah, I think that that's kind of how I'm using these terms in dialogue.
Yeah. So let's open it up for the audience for a few minutes before we close out, and hopefully sign some books and buy some books. Encouragement. So please, questions for Madeline. I'll call on people and repeat your question if it's needed. Yes, please, Max.
I'm gonna see if I can formulate this concisely. I was really interested in two things you said over that past little back and forth. One of which is that like the comedy is the sort of like politically organizing force, and one of which is that like that they'll write the fascists aren't funny, but they're not good comedians. But they are, we can grant them like good political acumen or something, right? They are organizing themselves in some fashion. So is it maybe the case that like comedy isn't about being funny, is what you're trying to say with this, or that like that's not the main like interest for how to think about this, or I don't know if that's a useful way in, but
Yeah, well, I think being funny is part of it, right?
sure.
But it's also about creating these insider spirit, like these inside groups, right? And the cultivation of, you know, who's in or outside of the joke, right? And that's actually the kind of political line, right? Yeah,
The figure of the jokester
Yeah.
that you talk about is very much about this sort of, like, the jokester is not necessarily funny, but very much about creating communities of violence around humor. And do you want to say a little bit about?
And also controlling what is and isn't comedy, what is and isn't joking, right? And so that's, I think, why it's so incredibly appealing to fascists, right? And I also think I'm suspicious of, one of the things I'm interested in is how a lot of these comedians who are very popular among the fascists really don't care one way or the other about whether they're fascist, right? It's just what, you know, they're going where the love is, where the crowds are. They're seeing that these kinds of jokes are working really well. And so it's not to say, not to give them a break over that, right? But I think that that's a really interesting problem in culture right now, right? That, like, I mean, the creator of Trump America's favorite television show, Yellowstone, thinks that it's a liberal show. And that's what he's going around saying, but it doesn't really matter what the hell he thinks the show is, right? When we see that this is a vastly appealing narrative to a certain like demographic, and that it's the #1 show in almost all the red states, right? But you probably haven't heard of it, right? So so I think that that's kind of an interesting tension. It's like, how much of this is intentional and how much of it is opportunistic? And in some cases, I do think that there are, you know, the Joe Rogans who are like absolutely aware of how fucked up their political project is, and that's fine with them. But I think that there's also, this is what's like scary about comedy, is that and like incels and things like that, it's like people just kind of find themselves in these groups because of these jokes and aren't really thinking about the political content of it at all. So I don't know if that sufficiently answered your question, or
Other questions? Yes, Barbs.
I haven't read the book yet, so I'm wondering if you go into any of the wonderful storied history of like memers specifically, and like left-wing memes, and especially like queer and trans memers who have been foundational in my life to some extent. Just like that kind of aspect of playing out like fascist, the development of like the fascist meme comedy, which are kind of contemporary.
That's a really good question. I don't talk about memers in my book, but I would say that that's a great example of people not buying into this idea that they can't be comedians, and that and yeah, taking it on as something that becomes a political language. I think it's really a good example of that. I mean, one of the arguments that I'm really making is that the Killjoy is the ultimate comedian of our time, and that it's not, that they insisted that the queer feminist is not funny, is contested in all sorts of ways. That's probably something I should have written about, but my next book. I'll put that in. But yeah, that's a great example of how that is operating.
Yeah, please.
When we think about Pepe Grillo in Italia or Zelensky in Ukraine, what do you think about comedians in politics? Which is
Yeah.
a new trend.
And I will say his name, Trump.
Sorry.
No, but yeah, that was one of the things that was really fascinating about his rise, and he wasn't taken seriously, right? It was partly because of the ways in which he was using kind of the idea of comedy or his own parody, right? But all the while we should have been taking that much more seriously. So I think yeah, all of these are really interesting instances in which, you know, we can see how comedy and the position of the comedian can be politically weaponized, and more reasons to be really thinking about the political practices of comedians, and that kind of slippage, you know, that we see with, I don't know, I think the Trump example haunts me, but the idea that he's the kind of the first stand-up president.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you so much for the. Madeline had the benefit of the same editor, Andy, and publisher, including Mala here, and both our books are in the back, and I think, are you open to sign?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you,
Fantastic.
Common Notion.
Yeah.
Common Notion Press.
And thank you so much to the Bureau for hosting so many phenomenal.
Thank you.